So what happens if there's an externality? We go back to our original problem where we had a demand for Spider-Man costumes in CU Boulder. And we have the supply and the demand. Now, as you know, the supply shows the marginal cost, so the cost of each unit, and the demand shows the marginal benefit, the benefit derived from each unit. Sometimes we call it a different way, but when we think about the supply and the marginal cost, we're thinking about the private costs for some producer. However, sometimes there are also social costs. And when we say social cost, at least in this example, we're talking about the marginal cost. Social costs that society faces for each unit produced. Perhaps pollution from transportation, fibers that pollute oceans. So let's suppose we're still in the customs example. Private costs would be the fabric, transporting this fabric, labor, paying for the labor who sourced the customs, the transportation of the costume, and then the marketing of the costume, and so on and so forth. We're going to introduce the concept of a deadweight loss. So, gains from trade start above the costs. We do not consider anything below costs because that's not a net gain. At the beginning, private producer has this little cost, but for society there's a huge cost in here. Therefore, we start counting the gains from trade above this line. There are still gains from trade all over until we get to this point. After that, what is happening is that the benefit is just up to this point, maybe at 23, while the costs are 30 something. Therefore, in this case, what is happening is that the costs are bigger than the benefits, and this is called a deadweight loss. And the problem is that from the private perspective of the producer and the consumer, they are not internalizing these costs into their transaction. They are not counting for the pollution of oceans or pollution of air. None of that is included. However, these costs still exist, and they may be even affecting their own well-being, children, or even themselves, but this is not internalized in the market. In this case, let's suppose that this social marginal cost is $6 per unit. And then we would need to find what is the optimum quantity to be transacted. It's not 25. That would be in the case of a private benefit and private cost. But when we include this externality, this social cost, then the optimum quantity is given by equating marginal benefits with marginal cost that includes the social cost, and solve for Q. In this case, we have 50 minus Q equals to Q plus 6. And we solve for Q, and it is a 22. So 22 would be the optimum quantity to produce, which is not being produced in this market because we are producing 25. Here's precisely when a tax is the solution. What a tax does is that from the perspective of the producer, this line goes all the way to here, precisely in the amount of the tax imposed. If there's a $6 tax per unit, then this line will move upward exactly $6, and then it will equate the social cost. And voila! So what happens now is that we need to find what would be the price now? Well, we go back to the demand, the willingness to pay for these 22 units. It's given by these $28. And this is the new equilibrium with a tax being imposed. These are the new producer surplus in red and the consumer surplus in blue. And now, as you know, the producer surplus and the consumer surplus create what it's called gains from trade. So let's compare the gains from trade in the case of no tax and the gains from trade in the case with a tax. With no tax, we have the gains from trade given by this blue triangle that is exactly the same as the gains from trade when we have a tax. However, with no tax, we also have a deadweight loss given by all these units that were produced and that in reality cost society more than the benefit it gives. While in the case of a tax, the units produced are stopped in 22. And therefore, since we have 22 units being produced, then we don't have this deadweight loss. And what happens is that creating and using and consuming Spider-Man costumes, you know what, it's good to a certain extent. Some people really have a lot of fun, but there's a point when the costs are greater than the benefits, and we should stop. Instead of producing 25,000 or 25 million costumes, we might just produce 22. And this way, everybody's happy. There's gains from trade, and there's no loss, no deadweight loss from this pollution being generated that creates costs for the society. So this very simple and amazing idea that consists in setting this tax that solves our problem, it's called a Pigouvian tax. And the reason it's a Pigouvian tax, it's because it was invented by Cecil Pigou. This picture is from the Wall Street Journal. He was a British economist. In my very humble opinion, born with all the perks you can imagine, smart, handsome, athletic. In his leisure hours, he would play cricket and tennis and golf and tour all over Britain with his bike. And he loved to write lengthy poems. And he was contemporary to Keynes and Winston Churchill. Well, he lived through the war, the First World War, and after that he was quiet. He played chess, he wrote stories for kids, and he taught economics. He was an ambulance driver during the war, where he had an illness in his heart. Anyway, he avoided conflict with economists when they used to fight a lot over ideas, not in journals but in person. And he retired by 65. In his words, incapable of the amount of concentrated effort necessary for a thorough revision of his books. Well, in my opinion, with his brains and his privilege, he did what he had to do. He came up with this beautiful solution that says that externalities should be taxed. And there you have the solution for climate change.